Geography has been an important variable in the development of the United States, bringing the 13 colonies together, giving economic logic to the expansion of slavery, and shaping distinct political and cultural zones. To see why, join me for this brief look at the political geography of the United States. The US is either the third or fourth largest country in the world, depending on whether you include its territorial and coastal waters or not. Once much smaller, it's one of the three countries in the Americas, along with Canada and Brazil, to have more than doubled its original size, and the only one of the three to span more than two continents. Although it features the Rockies, Appalachians, and the highest peak in North America, Denali in Alaska, the country is full of flat prairies and lowlands, making 760 meters, or 2,493 feet, its average elevation, lower than the global average and its neighbor to the south. Meanwhile, it is the third most populated country in the world after China and India. Its population is still anchored in the east, its historical heartland, with the exception of California, which is the state with the highest population in the country. This population tends to live in cities, with 80% of people living in core urban areas that sprawl far into the surrounding region. Other than its mountains, its main geographical feature is the Mississippi River, whose basin covers over a third of its continental area and whose role in the early exploration and capitalist development of the country cannot be overestimated. These main features make up for very diverse climate zones, with over 23 in the continental United States, with an additional 3 in Alaska and Hawaii, ranging from ice cap and tundra in the former to tropical rainforest in the latter. These climate zones do not coincide very well with cultural zones. In fact, given its size, Americans do not necessarily agree on their exact demarcations and like to argue about what states belong in what region. Nonetheless, generally speaking, the country is divided into 4 main zones. These are the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, and the West. The Northeast is the smallest of the zones and the one with the fewest national parks. Often further subdivided into the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions, this has been the area where some of the most important events in American history have taken place. It was here, for example, that one of the earliest permanent American settlements occurred at Plymouth Colony in 1620, where the spark for the American Revolution began, as resistance to taxation in the 1760s and 1770s resulted first in the Boston Tea Party and later the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Constitutional Convention was also held here in Philadelphia in 1787, as well as the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the major turning points in the Civil War. But perhaps most importantly, this is the region where the traditional center of American capital emerged. First with a market for commodities that included enslaved people, and later with an agreement between traders in 1792 that gave way to the New York Stock Exchange and the development of Wall Street. Finally, it was here that some of the most important centers of learning developed, including all of the Ivy League schools, such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and so on, as well as more recent but no less important colleges like MIT, NYU, Carnegie Mellon, etc. Today, it contains only 2 of the largest cities in the country, New York and Philadelphia, but a century ago, Boston, Pittsburgh, and Buffalo were all in the top 10, while Newark, Albany, and Hartford were all historically important economic centers, many of them full of immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. Given its large population, it is not surprising that a disproportionate number of prominent Americans were born here, including 16 presidents, or more than a third of all of them, and many other famous individuals such as Benjamin Franklin, J.P. Morgan, Frank Sinatra, Katharine Hepburn, Michael Jordan, Tom Cruise, Robert De Niro, Will Smith, and Taylor Swift, to name a few. A region always on the move, its food tends to echo that, as many of its distinctive dishes like New York pizza, lobster roll, cheesesteak, and Italian hot dogs tend to be simple foods that can be eaten on the go. The southern region was also hugely important in the development of the United States. It was here, after all, that both the first attempted English colony and permanent settlement occurred in North Carolina in 1585 and Virginia in 1609, respectively. Nonetheless, its significance is disproportionate, particularly when it comes to African American history. That's because its rich agricultural land made tobacco and cotton very profitable cash crops, which in turn required a large labor force whose demand was met with the use of enslaved Africans. This led to the construction of a slave society with very clear economic and social hierarchies that were held together by a white supremacist logic. That meant that historically, at its most basic level, politics in the region were entirely about sustaining or resisting this type of white supremacy, from the American Civil War to Reconstruction to the civil rights struggle late in the 19th century, all the way to the 1960s and the leadership of Martin Luther King. This explains why a disproportionate number of prominent black activists were born there, including Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, Thurgood Marshall, and of course the already mentioned Martin Luther King. The above dynamic also explains why the South has always been much more conservative than the rest of the country, skeptical of outsiders and of inclusive political projects that speak of universality, and why even its religion, a kind of evangelical Protestantism, most widely manifested in the Southern Baptist Christian denomination, is different than the rest of the country. The African American footprint is evident everywhere in the region, from the many genres of music with roots in the South, including jazz, blues, gospel, R&B, and rock and roll, to traditional Southern foods, which combine European techniques, black ingenuity, and the ingredients of native peoples to create the richest American regional cuisine, with iconic dishes such as barbecue, fried green tomatoes, and collard greens. Not to mention significant sub-regional cuisines like Cajun and Tex-Mex. Of course, the South's prominence stems not just from its black people. Indeed, the region produced perhaps the two Americans most likely to have been seen abroad, President George Washington, who was born in Virginia, and Abraham Lincoln, whose birthplace was Kentucky, as well as the two most iconic American brands of the 20th century, Elvis Presley and Coca-Cola. The Midwest's main geographical feature are the Great Lakes, the largest freshwater system in the world with an area of 94,250 square miles. The result of melting glaciers that began to recede about 20,000 years ago, the lakes contain over 20% of the world's total amount of fresh water. Most importantly for the region's historical development, the interlocking lake system is connected to the Atlantic via the St. Lawrence River, which made the region a strategic area that could connect the far west and eastern markets via the Erie Canal. The completion of the upstate New York waterway in 1825 made the Midwest a natural commercial entrepot and manufacturing hub. Perhaps no more so than in Chicago, which became a meatpacking center given its access to western beef and ice from Lake Michigan, especially after the 1850s when railroads supercharged the city's development. Given these economic advantages, the region also became a magnet for immigration and center for innovation. All sorts of things were invented here, including baby food, dishwashers, remote controls, masking tape, snow blowers, vacuum cleaners, airplanes, and perhaps the most important of all for the region, the assembly line, which transformed Detroit into the world's car manufacturing center. Nor was innovation limited to manufacturing. It was here, for example, that rock and roll first gained a foothold on the radio because of a station in Cleveland, Ohio, and where the new Motown label changed the R&B sound with acts like The Temptations, Supremes, and of course Marvin Gaye. Elsewhere, the region produced other artists that transformed their industries, including Steven Spielberg, Bob Dylan, Prince, and Michael Jackson. The Midwest also features the least visited of the country's most iconic landmarks, Mount Rushmore. Finished in 1941 after 14 years, the monument might also be the most controversial of all national landmarks because the sculptor, John Gutson, built on top of a mountain that was considered sacred by the local Plains Indians, who used it as a place to pray and gather medicine. The land was essentially stolen, a fact that was recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1980, in which granted the Sioux Indians $17 million for the land. But the tribe declined the payout because it would mean giving up their legal claim to a separate sacred area, the Black Hills. The West is the largest of the cultural zones, both physically and perhaps metaphorically, as it has a huge place in the American imaginary, and is the only one to have a whole movie genre named after it, the Western. That is because this region captures the expansionist fever that gripped the nation in the 19th century, as well as the bright and dark sides of the American dream, a seemingly endless place of opportunity coupled with a manifest destiny ideology that pushed its original inhabitants to the margins of American society. Or put another way, a land that appeared to offer nothing but freedom, but where nonetheless some people were more free than others. A place like that is bound to be full of stories which easily lend themselves to be told by Hollywood, an industry also conveniently and not coincidentally located in this region. The area is usually divided between the Mountain West, the states most closely associated with the Rocky Mountains, and the Pacific West, the states along the coast. In truth, the distance and latitude between Alaska and Hawaii and the rest of the country make them more unique than not, and could easily be their own separate regions. But one thing that all parts of the West share, from New Mexico to Hawaii, are vast natural spaces. This vastness is perhaps best captured by the many national parks that dot its landscape, including the largest, the Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska, the oldest, Yellowstone in Wyoming, the hottest, Death Valley in California, and some of the most iconic, the Grand Canyon in Arizona, Zion National Park in Utah, Glacier Bay in Alaska, and Yosemite and Sequoia Parks in California. The West's reputation as a land of opportunity has been somewhat tarnished in recent years, but it nonetheless can claim that 4 of the top 5 most valuable brands in the world all originated here: Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, and Microsoft. It can also boast the state with the highest GDP in the country, California, which enjoyed an economy whose size was $3.35 trillion in 2022, making it the 5th largest in the world if the state was its own country. Meanwhile, the region's geography has also shaped its cuisine. Hawaiian food, for example, is a mix of all kinds of cultures because of its location in the Pacific and the migrants that have come to call it home. That has given rise to dishes like poke, which combines fish, especially tuna, with all kinds of fresh ingredients. The loco moco, a burger topped with a fried egg on a bed of rice, and the kalua pua, a slow-roasted pork dish. Meanwhile, California and New Mexico, because of their history and proximity to Old Mexico, have also produced distinctive dishes. The former has made burritos into an art form and created some of its own, like the ever-popular California burrito, a fries and carne asada concoction from San Diego, or the also trendy Mission Burrito, a similar dish from San Francisco but with added rice and other ingredients, like pico de gallo. New Mexico, meanwhile, is known for traditional Mexican dishes that it has made its own, such as enchiladas and tamales, which feature the state's distinctive red or green chili peppers. The country is divided into 50 states, which vary widely in wealth, size, and population. The largest is Alaska, followed by Texas, while the smallest is Rhode Island, a state a bit bigger than Luxembourg. Meanwhile, the state with the highest GDP per capita is New York, followed by Massachusetts, while the lowest is Mississippi. And the one with the most people is California, while the lowest is Wyoming, with less than 600,000 people living there. Legally, there's a lot of difference between the states, not just in their autonomy, which allows them to write their own laws for the most part, but also in their representation, which treats them equally regardless of population in the Senate. Culturally, they are far more similar, although Americans like to think of each state as unique. In reality, those differences tend to be regional. For example, most of the country's preferred sport is American football, except for the Northeast, where baseball is still king. Most Americans use the term "you guys" when using the plural of you, while the South tends to prefer y'all, and so on. Lately, those differences have been exacerbated by political partisanship. More and more, Americans define themselves by the political party they prefer, placing themselves into blue states, those dominated by Democrats, and red states, those controlled by Republicans. Since 2000, states have followed a relatively stable electoral pattern. The South has been almost solidly red, the Northeast and Pacific West almost solidly blue, with only a handful tilting the balance of the presidency, especially those in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. The other source of differentiation, as always, are the new arrivals, who are bringing new customs and ideas to places across the country. This is especially so for Latinos in California, Texas, Florida, and New York, and Asian Americans in California, New Jersey, Virginia, and Nevada. How they will rewrite American history is still to be determined. As for you, I hope that if you've never been to the US, you can visit soon. There's a lot to see.